I don't care what anyone says. 12,000 subscribers is a big deal. If I asked you how many you know who you can call friends, you might say maybe 8 or 9. The amount of people who truly care about what you have to say is probably even less than that. I, on the other hand, have thousands of fans catching every new episode with fervor and praising me in the comments. It started off just as a hobby, and I suppose it still is. I do plan on quitting my job at Target though, as soon as the channel really starts to take off. It started off with prank videos, funny animals, and messing around with friends. Anything I thought might get the views pouring in. I didn't think that my big break would be the shaky GoPro footage of me and Josh crawling around the abandoned trailer park on the edge of our hometown. Josh, by the way, was my channel's co-creator. He was also my brother, but the less said about that, the better. Since that first taste of success, my channel became dedicated to urban exploring. Josh and I would take our van around the state, trespassing on abandoned yet still often private property. We filmed in old hospitals, apartment blocks, schools, that sort of thing. If we didn't find anything too interesting, sometimes we would reshoot a few scenes with a twist and add in a supernatural element. As safe as this formula was, things were starting to get stale. The last couple of videos were maybe getting a few hundred views each, and we were running out of interesting enough places to explore. The problem was our budget, or a lack thereof. We could barely afford respiratory masks to combat the constant patches of black mold that we would stumble across. To be able to travel to some of the most breathtaking locations even within the country, it felt like a distant dream. This is why the email felt like a godsend. I was throwing a quick eye over some junk mail, checking if anything important had slipped through before I deleted it all. And that's when I saw it. The guy's name was a jumbled bunch of letters and numbers, as was their Gmail account. What really caught my eye was the subject heading, "Interesting location." I clicked on it, expecting to find another suggestion for a great place to film, which then ends up being in Bulgaria or some other Eastern European country. Instead, the email was composed of a quick little message to me, followed by a set of coordinates. "Hi Hal Explorers, a big fan of the channel. I've been watching you for a year and I love what you do. I wanted to share a location with you. I found it recently. Inside past a cave mouth. Again, I love your channel. Please keep it up." I got the impression from the message that English wasn't their first language, which didn't give me much hope. Regardless, I copied the coordinates he included and pasted them into Google Maps. The pin dropped 5 miles from my house. I immediately rang Josh and told him to get his stuff ready. A day later, we had all the equipment that we could muster and a bag full of provisions, mainly pastrami sandwiches and Gatorade. On top of that, we had a flashlight, some semblance of a first aid kit, a length of rope, a piece of chalk, and a spare flashlight. So far, we've never used the rope for anything, but I find it helps with the professional image. It was during the drive to the location that I thought maybe we should have checked it out beforehand, just to make sure that it was worthwhile. Then again, even if it did turn out to be a dud, it's not like we wasted any gas money at this close of a distance. We drove into the forest and then the dirt path that pittered out. We parked up and grabbed our stuff. Now I know the area. I've spent most of my childhood exploring these woods. I knew there weren't any abandoned structures in the area, but what I did know was around is caves. Now my mother warned me extensively never to go near it. Carved into the sloping face of a small hill was the dark entrance to a cave system. Following the map on my phone, it took 20 minutes of walking to get from the path to the entrance. The first thing I noticed was a scattering of crumpled up beer cans and broken bottles. I feared that whatever treasure was down there had already been desecrated, but I carried on. "You know, Mom told us to never go near this place," Josh said abruptly. "Josh," I said, shining my torch in his face. "You're 24, man. What do you care what Mom says?" "Nah, it's not that. It's just she really didn't like us playing out here, you know. I don't think we even saw this place and she was still warning us." I crouched at the entrance and shone my light into the shadows. The cave went on another few meters and then stopped short of anything interesting. I took a few steps towards and saw that there was a thin opening near the back. Bingo. I grabbed the bag and moved forward. "I think a school friend of Mom's went missing here when she was younger," I said to Josh, goading him in. "That's why she was so paranoid." Josh tentatively followed me deeper in. The thin opening was only a little wider than my forearm. It was a tight squeeze, but I reckoned that I could make it. I faced my torch towards the opening and saw that the ground underneath looked firm, and only around 2 meters down. "Okay, Josh, start filming," I said as I took the rope from my bag. I tied a random Boy Scout knot around my waist and threw the other end of the cord just out of shot. Josh held the small camera in front of him and gave me the thumbs up. I winked at the camera and threw my bag down the opening. Josh immediately stopped recording. "Wait, you're actually going down?" he asked, actually concerned. "Sure we are, and don't stop recording," I said as I threw my legs forward and fell down into the opening. A slight graze was the worst of it. I grabbed my bag and shouted for Josh to come down. I picked up my torch and illuminated the area around me. I had fallen into a small, cavernous chamber. I could hear the faint dripping of water from stalactites, and at the edge of the chamber was a hole, brutalized into the rock face. I walked over to it as Josh began to shimmy down the crack. "Hey Josh, I think I found something," I said, casting the beam of my light down the tunnel. Josh landed gruffly and picked up his bag and equipment and walked over to my side. With a sigh, he followed me into the tunnel. He carried on for a few yards before leading into another chamber. We repeated our maneuver of dropping the supplies in first before crawling in ourselves. This cavern was sloped and uneven. With only one direction to go, we continued descending forward. Dishearteningly, we came to a dead end. We dropped the bags again and looked at each other. "Maybe it's a dud," Josh suggested. Probably. I had high hopes though," I said as I took a sip from my water bottle and leaned against the wall. I felt something sharp dig into my side. "What the heck?" I muttered to myself, turning around. I shone my torch towards where I had been leaning. Sticking out from the wall was a metal door handle. I looked at Josh to make sure that he was filming, and then back at the handle. It was barely noticeable, covered in rust and sediment. I tried it. It creaked and grinded against some equally rusty internal mechanism. I pulled back and watched as a large rectangular section of the wall swung open. I turned to Josh, a look of pure glee plastered across my face as I pumped out some spiel for the video, hyping up our discovery. I talked to the camera as I walked into the unknowably long, uniform concrete tunnel that lay on the other side of the door. The metal door, whether on purpose or due to the sheer process of time, was covered in sediment which blended into the cave walls. As we entered the corridor, Josh made sure to leave marks of chalk on the wall. With most buildings, it was never too hard to find your way out again. This place, however, was shaping up to be a real maze. I wouldn't have been shocked if we came across a minotaur. It was pitch black, pure darkness other than the weak beams of our torches. My only worry was the footage quality as Josh and I descended further into the tunnel. It snaked sharply left from right, but never split into more than one continuous path. The walls were dry and gray. Other than the occasional stain, they were completely bare. I had stopped talking now, letting Josh film me traversing the corridor from behind. After a few minutes of walking, we turned a corner that ended in another door. Once he arrived at it, I realized that it was the exact same as the first one that we had come through, only without the obvious aging. It was metal, robust, and covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't budged in a decade. I let Josh squeeze past me, which was difficult in the cramped quarters, and get a close-up on the door. Once he had, I told him to open it. Wordlessly, he did. We entered a small, white-tiled room with rusty shower heads lining the walls. Through another identical door, we came into what looked like a locker room. Hanging all around us were jumpsuits and masks, all made from the same rubber-like material, all a dull amber in color. Josh filmed me taking one of the dust-covered masks down from the wall. I held it in front of my face and made a reference to an obscure video game. Before moving out of the room, I hung the mask back up. There was an old Urban Explorer motto: "Take only pictures, leave only footprints." I followed it most of the time. Beyond the next iron door was a flight of stairs, descending even further. The steps were concrete and scattered with once sodden, now bone-dry papers. I held the torch level as we walked down them. The hand railing was rusted and the fluorescent light bulbs overhead were shattered. I felt the broken glass crunch under my boots as I neared the bottom. The stairs ended in a lobby that wouldn't have looked out of place in a medical institution. I walked out over double doors that lay on the ground, covered in debris. Shining the light around, I saw that there were 3 different passageways leading out from this main room. Josh was filming the rows of old tattered seats as I walked towards the map painted onto the far wall. It had a helpful orange square with "You are here" written next to it. In white paint, it outlined the structure's layout. If it was accurate, then this place was truly massive. I called Josh over. "What did you find?" he asked, poising the camera recorder. "I think it's a diagram of this place," I told him, my finger following the map's trails. Josh zoomed in as I noticed the symbol key. Dotted around the map were small denotations. I matched them with the key, trying to figure out which rooms were being shown. Canteen, bunkhouse, recreational facility, breaching room. Josh took more footage while I read through the list of functions, which were printed out on a fading piece of laminate attached to a hanging clipboard. I got to the end and saw that we were on floor 1 of 9. "Holy crap, this place is huge," I muttered. "What do you think this is anyway?" Josh asked. I turned to him but looked directly at the camera when I answered. "Well, of course we don't know, but my best guess would be some sort of nuclear facility. Maybe a decommissioned bunker, something along those lines. You know, the government rarely told us where they built these things, so it wouldn't be all that crazy." Once the scene had exhausted itself, I took a picture of the old map on my phone and we moved on. The place was an absolute goldmine. It was like a mix between a Soviet weapons silo and an old hospital. We left marks on the Libertine walls to help with the last case scenario of getting lost. I felt more confident now with the map, but we couldn't be taking any chances. Every single surface was covered in grit and grime. I could see the particles dance and shift within my torch's beam. As I walked down these abandoned halls, ducking into every room without a locked door, I couldn't believe that nobody else had come across this place before. I was excited. This felt like the big break my channel needed, and Josh was recording every second of it. Most of the first floor was rooms full of stacked beds. The bunkhouse where the workers would have slept and I imagine spent most of their time. I couldn't help but wonder what they were doing down here. I sat on the edge of one of the beds and pulled out a locked box from underneath. It was heavy and made from solid leather. After a while of trying, I realized that I couldn't open it with brute strength, and I kicked it back under the bed. As I stood, I realized every bed had a similar locked box underneath. I tried a few more, all with the same issue. I shrugged at the camera and I left the room. After walking around the first floor for a few minutes more, we came across another stairwell. I motioned to the camera to follow me down as I grabbed the rotting wooden handrail and descended further into the facility. 2 turns later, the stairs ended in a narrow corridor. Countless doors, most of them locked, were dotted along the walls. I tried to peer through these small windows on the doors whenever they had one, but something covered each of them from the other side. This floor, the second floor, was a maze in every sense of the word. Josh filmed me taking a dozen corners left, right until we came to another small foyer. I sat on one of the decomposing chairs and I tied my shoelace. I shivered as a cold breeze caressed my neck. Judging from Josh's reaction, he felt the same thing. I looked around for a vent, but I didn't see one. I stood up and kept moving. We pushed through a series of hanging plastic sheets, and on the other side were greeted with another door leading into another stairwell. I took out my phone to check my picture of the map, and realized that it only showed the layout of the first floor. I smiled when I realized my error and made a joke about my intelligence, or a lack thereof, to the camera. I put my phone back in my pocket and I opened the door. Halfway down this flight of stairs was an overturned desk and 2 chairs. I crouched and opened the small drawers on the overturned desks. A few pens fell out, nothing of note. I climbed over the obstacles and then took the camera from Josh so that he could do the same. Once we were on the other side, I turned and dramatically kicked the double doors open, making a movie reference as I went. There was a door directly to the left of where we came into. We ignored it for now, instead of walking to the end of the snubbed corridor. There were 2 doors and a sign containing 2 arrows, one pointing towards the bathrooms and the other towards a dining hall. "Well, I am feeling pretty hungry," I said to the camera, rubbing my stomach. I cringed soon after and made a mental note to cut that out. Through the swinging doors and into the canteen, we were greeted by the largest room that we had seen yet. It must have had the floor space of a football pitch or two, and the rows of benches blurred into a mirage the further that they went. I'd like to remind you at this point that we were in total absolute darkness, other than what light our handheld torches threw out. As we ambled through the hall, it was a wonder that we didn't trip over anything. A small glint caught my eye, and I sat down on one of the sterile blue-gray plastic benches. Josh stood next to me and filmed close up what had lured me over. I admit I thought it was a coin or maybe a hunk of jewelry, but instead it was a piece of foil wrapper. I picked it up and looked more closely. It was a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum with 1 bit left. If this is what they were eating down here, no wonder the place is abandoned. "Look at all these E numbers," I said, holding the wrapper up to the camera. I stood and we began walking over to the kitchen. As we did, I kept repeating the same joke I had made in my head over and over. I realized it didn't make any sense, as people don't exactly eat chewing gum, but I didn't feel like reshooting anything either. We kept moving towards the kitchen, and as we did, the smell got worse. Once we had hopped the counter and actually gone into the area where they kept the now long since rotten food, the smell became too much to handle. Josh retreated, burying his nose in his elbow. I persevered long enough to peek into the freezer. Its preserving cold had long since faded, and the meat that once hung in there was now a stale and black puddle. I gagged and rushed out. Josh filmed me hopping the counter, and we started to walk back to the door that we came through. I stopped, noticing something hanging on one of the white concrete pillars. It was a calendar. I walked over to it and beckoned Josh to do the same. It was left open on March, and every day before the 27th was marked with a red X. I flipped it to the front and saw that it was for the year 2009. We took plenty of footage of my discovery, and I shared my theory in a more serious tone that this must have been when the place became abandoned. After we were done filming, we decided to sit at one of the benches and eat. If you're wondering, I had one of those pastrami sandwiches that we had packed and a Dr. Pepper. Now satiated, we exited to the hall. As soon as we had entered it, I turned left. "Don't you want to film the toilets?" Josh asked, tugging at my shoulder. I'm sure there'll be more around the lower levels and we can film in them. I just want to keep powering forward, I said. And besides, we just ate. I don't want to go gawk over some fossilized, decade-old human crab. Josh shrank back and we arrived at the door next to the one that we came in. It was yet another staircase that we followed down to the 4th floor. As soon as we reached that floor, I knew that we had hit the jackpot. It was like some of the abandoned hospitals that we had seen, but on steroids. Long medical white halls were littered in rusty and decaying equipment. Scalpels and other tools were strewn everywhere. A patient-less IV drip stood at the end of the first hallway like a ghost. I had Josh focus on the bloodied, bunched-up sheets that blockaded a doorway while I snooped around one of the accessible rooms. Inside was what looked like a dentist chair, only it had a large iron tripod dangling from the ceiling above. I felt like a kid in a sweet shop as I looked through all the cupboards and drawers, finding dozens of files and even more cobweb-covered equipment. Among the rubbish, I found a pizza box-sized silver container. I opened it with a click, and inside I found a stack of microfiche. It may have been born after the millennium, but I still knew what they were. I didn't see a microfiche reader anyway in the room, so I walked back out into the halls. I suddenly had what I thought was a great idea, and I held the film in front of my face. I held my torch on the other side and shined it towards me. Instead of illuminating the imprinted images, I momentarily blinded myself. I laughed at my own stupidity and leaned against a wall, rubbing my eyes. And then I heard Josh call me. I followed the sound of his voice past another stairwell entry and around the corridor's bend. He was standing with his camera in front of a giant, obstructed pile of dirt that came down from a portion of collapsed ceiling. Realizing there was no way through, I doubled back and made my way to the door that we had come through. Looking around, I realized that there was no other passageway apart from the one that we had already explored, nor did any of the unlocked rooms have a second door. Cursing, I found Josh again. There's no other way onto the rest of the floor, I told him, although he had already come to the same conclusion. With a sense of defeat, we left what had been by far the most interesting and promising section of the facility and carried on down to the 5th floor. We didn't stay for long. A pipe had obviously burst somewhere and the ground was covered in a few inches of grimy and brown water. We tried to navigate our way by hopping from one rotting wooden panel to another. A few gave way under our weight, and by the time that we had reached the door out of there, our shoes and socks were drenched. Not that I was paying much attention, but I reckoned that most of the rooms in that section were being used for storage. We quickly opened the door and closed it, only letting in a small torrent of water which accompanied us down the steps in the form of a fast trickle. The room that we came into was promising, as it had a similar medical flair as the 4th floor. We almost turned left when I noticed the symbol on the door to our right. I approached it, my cameraman close behind, and saw that on the door was the silhouette of a rabbit depicted in red paint. With a strange sense of unease, I grabbed the door handle and barged into the next room. It looked like an interrogation room. From where we were, we could see through the one-way mirror. There was a long mahogany desk covered in what looked like radio equipment. Half a dozen swivel chairs surrounded us. It looked like the production control room at this TV studio that I once interned at. In the blank room beyond the mirror was a chair. No desk, just a lone chair facing us. I noticed that there was no door between this room and the blank room, nor was there any door at all leading into the blank room. We ducked out and continued on through the left side door. Jackpot again. It was almost a carbon copy of the 4th floor, except it was strangely carpeted. The thin maroon carpet was caked in dust, and it dragged my eyes away from the otherwise white walls. The first room I entered luckily had just what I was looking for, a magnifying glass. Not exactly a microfiche reader, but I suppose it wouldn't have worked without electricity anyway. I took the crumpled strip of images from my pocket and held them to the magnifier. The images were grotesque. I was holding 98 tiny pictures of conjoined twins, each connected at the head. The pictures were all taken from various angles and, nearer the end of the rows, various levels of decomposition. The very last image on the slide showed a botched attempt to separate the pair. I gagged and I dropped the microfiche. "What is it?" Josh asked dumbly as I stormed past him. He followed me into the hall where I slumped against a wall and slowly edged down onto the floor. Josh loomed over me. "Stop recording," I said, and he did. He sat next to me and comforted me, not knowing exactly what had gotten me so worked up. In myself, I knew that it wasn't just the photos. I was starting to let the sterile monotony of this place get to me. "Do you want to turn back?" Josh asked. "I think we have enough footage." I smiled. "Hey, it's fine, I want to keep going. I just need a break," I said. He nodded and patted my shoulder. He stood, leaving the recorder next to me, and he walked into one of the rooms. I absent-mindedly began to caress the scar along my abdomen, left over from the less than professional operation that separated me and Josh soon after birth. Josh came back out of the room soon after, holding a fading binder of documents. Now, I was never good at math or academia in general, but I could recognize the symbol on the front of the binder as the symbol of pi, only turned upside down. "Interesting read?" I asked in earnest. Josh didn't reply, and he kept looking at the documents intently. Before I could say anything else, he began to read aloud. "Subject Aleph shows signs of successful tether realignment. He has answered 42 of the 45 questions of the Clem assessment accurately, while displaying little distress. He has continued to develop Tav's hobbies and interests since his brother's disassembling. Dr. Redacted has reported contact with Tav, although this is an impossibility. Aleph expresses connection to the Red Rabbit, furthering evidence of tether realignment." I grow increasingly confused the more Josh reads it out. "What does any of that mean?" I finally asked him. "Oh, who knows," Josh replied, thumbing through the remaining documents. He closes it and reads out the message stamped on the front. "Property of the Red Rabbit Group," he says, and then shares his theory. "My money is still on some weird government stuff. God knows what they've been doing behind the public's back." I stand, brushing the ceiling flakes from my trousers. I put a hand on Josh's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "God doesn't have anything to do with this," I said, and then, "Actually, do you mind if we do this all again on film?" After that, we walked down the dark hallways with a newfound unease. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, but I also couldn't imagine what could be inside some of those rooms. Something more terrifying than any boogeyman, no doubt. Man's curiosity. We turned a corner and saw someone, or at least that's what we thought, while our hearts beat out of our chests. Fixing our torches on it, we saw that it was a suit. Looking closer, we saw that it was made of rubber and covered in straps. It looked like a gimp suit, we realized, and it was hanging down from the ceiling, its collar caught around a broken strip of light. "I hope you didn't poop yourselves," I said, looking at the camera from over my shoulder. I went over to the hanging suit and I nudged it. It swung back and forth, creaking as it did. The closer that I got to it, the more the smell of vinegar overpowered me. I backed away from it and I bumped into Josh, who had turned his and the camera's attention to the burn marks on the door to our left. We pushed through it and descended into the 7th floor. The first thing that we see is a skeleton. Laying and facing the ceiling was a bleached human skeleton dressed in a coral gray suit. My brother and I immediately freaked out, and I dropped my flashlight, the bulb shattering. Josh handed me the camera and he approached the apparent body. He knelt by it, strangely calm, and then laughed. Hey, it's plastic, don't worry, he said, grinning. Probably a lab dummy. And now in the role of cameraman, I recorded my brother's interaction with the faux skeleton. He grabbed the skull and with a little elbow grease it came off. He stood up, quoted Shakespeare, and then punted the skull down the hallway. We laughed and I set the camera down. Josh held the light over me while I hunted through my bag for a spare torch. I found it and we carried on. The first room we entered clearly used to be some sort of operating theater. We walked past the rows of wooden seats which were arranged like a small sporting area around a white stained covered hospital bed. The room gave me a bad feeling, so we quickly walked past the bed and out of the door on the far side. We came into yet another identical hall. Shining my light, I saw that there was an old wheelchair into T-junction at one end of the hall, and at the other end was a door with the same red silhouette of a rabbit. We paced towards the rabbit door, which we found unfortunately to be locked. Kicking bits of concrete out of the way, we turned to walk up the passageway. We filled the place with artificial lights and saw, to our horror, that the wheelchair was gone. "What the heck?" Josh said. He had noticed it first. "What?" I asked, concerned. "What's wrong?" "Wasn't there a wheelchair right there a second ago?" he pointed out. I stood still for a moment, mulling over his question. I quickly realized that he was right. Against our better judgment, we tentatively approached the end of the hall. Josh filmed me creeping around the T-junction, and that's when I saw it. A few meters down the corridor was the wheelchair. I looked back at the camera as I slinked towards it. It was rusted beyond repair and the wheels appeared to be buckled. I took a step forward and saw what was laying on the seat. I find it difficult to describe. It was covered in a similar material to the suit that we had seen hanging the floor above, only it didn't have any straps, or any seams at all for that matter. It was a black box with a weird sphere resting on top. The sphere had what looked like a metal funnel embedded into the front. Only the tube was a snub, barely 2 centimeters long. Dangling from it was a small length of string. I took it in my hand and I tried to yank it off, but it just kept on coming. I felt like a kid trying to pull loose a thread from his cardigan, only to unravel the whole thing. The string that was being pulled out was stained black and wet. Josh came and stood next to me, filming what was going on. Suddenly, he retracted the camera and gasped. I looked around, unsure what got to him. "What's wrong, man?" I asked. That's... He stuttered, pointing at the thing slumped on the wheelchair. "That's a torso." At that, I looked back at the slumped object and studied it. Admittedly, I could see what he meant. It did kind of look like a person with their arms and legs stripped away, but that was impossible. Josh was about to speak again when suddenly, I felt a debilitating pain wash over my forehead, and then my entire skull. I fell against a nearby wall, an exposed pipe digging into my back, but that pain was nothing compared to the hum in my brain. I grit my teeth so hard that I thought they would shatter, and I looked at my brother from behind my hands, which clawed at my face. From his reaction, I could tell that he was feeling the same thing. I dropped my flashlight to the ground, and its beam illuminated Josh. I couldn't see his light, nor the thing in the wheelchair, which was now plunged into darkness. The pain reached such an unbearable peak that thoughts of suicide briefly crossed my mind, and then, as quickly as it came on, it went. I stumbled to Josh and helped him to his feet. We held each other, still shaking and sweating, tears welling in our eyes. As we began to collect ourselves, we heard a voice, not from anywhere around us, but from deep inside of our own minds. "My name is Deas." I picked my torch up and looked around. Its light fell on the figure sitting in the wheelchair. It suddenly looked a whole lot more like a human. "Have you seen answers?" A voice echoed in my mind again. "What?" whispered Josh. I realized that he was hearing it as well. Suddenly, the wheelchair rolled forward as if pushed by an unseen nurse. And sus. The voice repeated itself as the wheelchair drew nearer. Now I was certain that that thing was its source. The names, Ansas and Degas, repeated themselves in my mind. They carried an odd familiarity. I reached my hand into my pocket and pulled out the now crumpled microfiche. In the dimming light, I saw what was written in black pen just above the rows of images. Brothers Ansas and Degas, pre and post-op. I looked up at the thing on the wheelchair and realized that it was indeed human. I extended my arm and handed the microfiche to him. It began to float out of my hand and hover in front of Degas. It slowly rotated and then fell to the floor, released from his mental grasp. As he was completely covered, I couldn't have possibly realized how much of a rage he went into when he saw the photos. I only noticed when Josh had dropped to his knees. I watched in terror as Josh, tears streaming from his eyes, grabbed a large piece of concrete that had been chipped away from the walls. He begged and pleaded with Degas as he lifted the block above his own head and brought it crashing down. I realized what was going on and I dropped to my brother's side. I wrapped my arms around his, trying to get him to stop, but they moved with a strength that wasn't his own. Muscles popped and veins burst as he kept driving the stone block into his head again and again. I fell backwards and stared as Josh's head turned to mush. There was no way that he was still alive, yet his arms kept moving, kept grinding his own skull into a pulp. Finally, he lowered the now red chunk of concrete. His arms returned to their side and he didn't stir again. As soon as I heard the creak of that wheelchair move toward me, I bolted. Screaming, the flashlight in my hand bounced up and down as I ran. This distorted my view and is likely why I didn't see the mesh of pipes and plastic in front of me. I ran directly onto it and it gave out from underneath me. I plunged down the hole and fell against the hard rock of the 8th floor. I had landed on my arm and the torch. Both were now broken. In complete pitch blackness, I stood up. I clutched my shattered arm and limped forwards, still content on getting away from Degas. I walked into a wall and I realized that I had to calm myself and be careful. The next, by my best guess, 4 hours was spent crawling around the 8th floor in total darkness. I was feeling along the walls trying to find a doorway that led to stairs going up. I had no such luck though, although my hands were now cut up from dragging them against the jagged surroundings. Another hour into my hopeless wandering, I saw it, a tiny red dot just ahead of me. I cautiously put one foot in front of the other and I made my way towards it. I bent down and I reached out. My hand touched Josh's camera, which was still wet with his blood. I recoiled as I realized its implication. I had left it where it was by my brother's body. How did it end up down here? The possibilities all chilled me to my core. Regardless, out of necessity, I picked up the camcorder. After some fiddling, I managed to switch on the night vision mode. I held it to my eye and looked around. The walls were covered in paintings of red rabbits, all around me swirling into a bizarre mural. I had been walking among them for hours. The floor was covered in bits of cloth and broken furniture, which had kept me on uneasy footing since I fell down here. I crept over them as I carried on my search for the stairwell door, now in a world of grainy and artificial green. The next corridor I turned into ended in a wheelchair. I squinted and saw that it was moving forward. It was Degas. I turned and tried to run, but my exhausted body wouldn't let me. I turned left and then right, limping down a hall I didn't think that I had been down before. I realized too late that if the door at the end of the hall was locked, then I was at a dead end. I turned to see Degas roll around the edge of the passageway cornering me. I backed up against the door and turned the handle. It swung and I was greeted with the 9th floor. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of skeletal bodies lined the floor. Really, there was no ninth floor. Every installation had been ripped away apart from the first few steps of the staircase, creating a giant cavern of death. Fist clenched, I shuffled around to look at deas. He was directly in front of me, and the string from his muzzle began to lift into the air. I didn't want the same fate as Josh, so I took a step back. The last thing I remembered from that day was falling. I woke up an unknowable amount of time later. It took me a while to realize that I was laying in the grass amongst a scattering of beer cans. I was in the middle of the woods, right outside of the cave entrance. It was bright out, only a little after noon. I walked and I didn't stop walking until I had reached the road. I had been gone for 17 days. In that time, Josh and I had been reported missing. The police had carried out a search but found nothing. The day before I turned up, it had been called off. My family was overjoyed to have me back, but the pain felt of losing Josh was immeasurable. I told the cops what happened as best I could. I'm not sure how much of my story they believed, but they did bring me with them to find the door at the bottom of the caves. They never did. After that, my story was essentially discredited. It was at this time that I began to dream of a red rabbit. It would dance around me in a meadow and try to lead me into the forest. I never followed it. A week later, I finally found some time to myself. I slumped on the bed of my childhood room as I had been staying with my parents since I returned. After a nap, I sat up in bed and realized that I hadn't opened the bag that I brought with me. I grabbed it, unzipped it, and emptied out its contents. It had a few things that we had brought left in it. Unfortunately, my camera was never found. One last thing fell out when I gave it an extra shake. A document. I realized that Josh must have shoved it in there and didn't live long enough to tell me. I sat down and for the past few hours, I read all the way through it. The US government sanctioned all of this. They've been experimenting on victims of creepypastas. I still don't know how long this has been going on, but the founder of the Red Rabbit Group, Heinz Klemm, was brought to America from Germany in 1947. They were studying some form of telekinesis or telepathy or something. I need to write more, I have to write more, but I've just looked outside my window and realized that the same black van that was parked across the street this morning is still there. Please, if you're listening, get the message out. Whether it's the man in the trench coat knocking on the front door, or the increasing pain that I feel along my now oddly fresh and raw separation scar, I don't think that I'll be around for much longer. Damon McCory, Rain, Big Country Allen, Jerry Ramey, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Gasher, Dala Magara, Caden Gibbler, Justin Fotenauer, MB Massacre 91, That One Woodsman,